It was just another Tuesday morning in Providence Municipal Court until Judge Frank Caprio called the name David Thompson. What happened next would become the most emotional case of his 40-year career, because the man standing before him had once stood between President Obama and death itself. The courtroom. Doors opened at 9:32 a.m., and everyone felt it, that shift in energy when someone with serious training enters a room. David Thompson, 52 years old, moved like water. His dark suit was pressed to perfection. His shoes caught the fluorescent lights, but his eyes told a different story. Dark circles underneath, a slight tremor in his hands, shoulders carrying weight that no one else could see. He was here for speeding. 45 miles per hour in a 25 miles per hour school zone. On paper, just another traffic violation. But you don't know what Judge Caprio is about to discover. State of Rhode Island versus David Michael Thompson. The court clerk announced case number 2024 MV9847. Excessive speed in a school zone. David stood with military precision. Judge Caprio, now 78 years old, looked up from his paperwork. For decades on the bench had given him a sixth sense about people. Mr. Thompson, Judge Caprio began, his voice carrying that grandfatherly warmth that made him famous worldwide. According to the citation, you were traveling 45 miles per hour in a 25 zone near Jefferson Elementary School on November 28th at 2:47 p.m. How do you plead? Guilty, Your Honor. David's voice was steady, controlled. The voice of someone trained to stay calm under pressure. I was speeding. I take full responsibility. No excuses, no deflection, just accountability. Judge Caprio's radar pinged. In 40 years, he'd learned that people who accept responsibility this quickly usually have a damn good reason for what they did. Mr. Thompson, can you explain the circumstances that led to this violation? And here's where everything changes. David's jaw tightened for the first time. His composure cracked just slightly. Your Honor, I was rushing to reach my son at his school. I had received a call from the principal. There was an urgent situation requiring my immediate presence. Judge Caprio leaned forward. What kind of urgent situation, Mr. Thompson? David's eyes met the judge's. In that moment, Judge Caprio saw something that made his heart drop. Your Honor, my son has been struggling with severe depression and anxiety disorder. The principal called to inform me that he had written what appeared to be a suicide note.
Wow.
The courtroom went silent. Not traffic court, silent funeral, silent. And you need to understand something. Judge Caprio's voice was barely above a whisper. Now, before we go any further, Mr. Thompson, I need to know, is your son safe? He is now, Your Honor, thanks to the school counselor. Good. Judge Caprio nodded slowly. Now, help me understand your background. Because I have a feeling there's more to your story. What David reveals next will change everything you think you know about heroism. David straightened his spine. Even here, facing a judge about to reveal his most painful truth, he stood like a soldier. Your Honor, I served on the presidential security detail for President Obama. 6 years. From 2009 to 2015, the courtroom exploded in whispers. Judge Caprio's eyes widened. This wasn't just any defendant. This was someone who had literally put his body between a president and potential assassins every single day. Mr. Thompson, you protected President Obama? Yes, Your Honor. I was part of the counter-assault team. My job was to neutralize threats against the president during public appearances, travel security, and at secure locations, including the White House. People in the gallery were already pulling out their phones, searching for Obama-era photos, wondering if they could spot David Thompson in the background of history. Judge Caprio stood up from his bench, his signature move when something deeply moved him. And you're still with the Secret Service? No, Your Honor. I retired in 2015. Why? Judge Caprio asked gently. Men don't usually leave positions like that voluntarily. Here's where the story gets heartbreaking. David was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of the hardest decision of his life. Your Honor, my son was diagnosed with severe clinical depression and anxiety disorder when he was 12 years old. The demands of my position, the travel, the long hours, the security restrictions that prevented me from discussing my work, made it increasingly difficult for me to be the father he needed. Judge Caprio felt chills run down his spine. "You left the Secret Service to take care of your son?" "Yes, Your Honor. I could protect the President of the United States, but I couldn't protect my own child from his depression. The only way to help him was to be present in his life consistently. Every day, the courtroom was processing what they were hearing. This man had walked away from one of the most prestigious positions in federal law, enforcement, to care for his mentally ill child. But you still don't know the most devastating part?" Judge Caprio walked around his bench, eliminating the formal barrier between himself and David. "Mr. Thompson, that must have been an incredibly difficult decision. How has your son been since you left the service?" And what David says next will break your heart. David's controlled expression finally cracked. The mask of the trained federal agent slipped, revealing the exhausted, terrified father underneath. "It's been a struggle, Your Honor. Some years are better than others. He's had multiple hospitalizations, several medication adjustments, ongoing therapy." He paused, gathering strength. The transition from being the Secret Service agent's son to having a father who was fully present helped for a while. But depression is... His voice broke slightly. "Depression is a relentless enemy, Your Honor." Judge Caprio's own eyes were glistening now. "Mr. Thompson, you mentioned you were speeding to reach your son because of a suicide note. Can you tell me more about what happened that day?" David took a deep breath. This was clearly one of the most painful memories of his life, Your Honor. "My son had seemed to be doing better recently. He was attending school regularly, participating in some activities. He'd even talked about college applications." A small, sad smile crossed his face. But depression can be deceptive. On November 28th, his English teacher found a note my son had written, a goodbye letter. "What did the note say?" David's voice was barely audible now. It said that he was tired of being a burden. He felt like he would never be able to live up to being the son of someone who had served the president. Everyone expected him to be as strong and disciplined as his father, but he felt weak and broken every day. People in the gallery were crying openly. "Your Honor," David continued, each word clearly painful. "My son wrote that he knew I had given up my career to take care of him, and that the guilt of that sacrifice was making his depression worse. He said he thought everyone would be better off if he weren't alive to be a burden anymore." The cruel irony hit everyone in the room at once. David Thompson had sacrificed his prestigious career to save his son, but that very sacrifice had become part of his son's guilt and self-destructive thoughts. Judge Caprio's voice was thick with emotion.
"Mr. Thompson, when you received that call from the school, what went through your mind?" And David's answer will show you what real heroism looks like. "Terror, Your Honor. Absolute terror." David's
hands were shaking now, the trained composure completely gone. I had spent 6 years prepared to take a bullet for President Obama. I had trained for every possible threat scenario. But nothing in my training prepared me for the possibility that I might lose my son to his own mind. He looked directly at Judge Caprio. "I got in my car and drove as fast as I could because I knew that every minute could be the difference between life and death. I made it in 6 minutes instead of the usual 15, and when you arrived, he was alive, Your Honor." The school counselor had been talking with him. They had convinced him to wait for me to arrive. David's voice broke completely. But seeing him sitting there so small, so broken, knowing that my love for him had somehow become part of his pain, it was the hardest moment of my life, Your Honor. Judge Caprio realized he needed to understand the full picture. "Mr. Thompson, I need to ask you something. How are you supporting your family since leaving the Secret Service?" David hesitated, clearly uncomfortable discussing his financial situation in public. "Your Honor, I currently work as a security consultant for small businesses. The pay is significantly less than what I earned with the service, about 70% less. I went from earning approximately $95,000 annually with full federal benefits to making roughly $28,000 per year with no health insurance." The courtroom gasped audibly. "Mr. Thompson, with that significant reduction in income, how do you manage your son's medical expenses?" "It's a constant struggle, Your Honor." Mental health treatment is expensive, especially without insurance. My son sees a psychiatrist monthly at $200 per session. A therapist is weekly at $120 per session. His medications cost approximately $400 per month. That's over $1,000 monthly, just for his basic mental health care. Almost 40% of my gross income. Judge Caprio did the math quickly, his face reflecting the impossible situation. How do you manage housing, food, other necessities? We've had to make sacrifices, Your Honor. We moved from our home in Washington, D.C. to a small apartment here in Providence to reduce living costs. I drive a 15-year-old car. We shop at discount stores, use food assistance when necessary. David's voice became firm, even proud, but my son's treatment is non-negotiable, Your Honor. His life is worth more than any amount of money, but you still don't know the cruelest part of the story. Mr. Thompson, Judge Caprio's voice was barely controlled now. On the day you were speeding to reach your son, after dealing with his crisis, were you able to afford the psychiatric intervention he might have needed? And David's answer will show you the impossible choice. No, Your Honor, I wasn't. The words hung in the air like a death sentence. That's part of what made the situation so desperate. If my son had needed immediate psychiatric hospitalization, I didn't have the money to pay for it. I was racing to the school, not just to save his life, but also knowing that I might not be able to afford the professional help he would need afterward. What happened after you arrived at the school that day? The school counselor had managed to de-escalate the immediate crisis, but she recommended that my son be evaluated at the hospital emergency room. I knew that would likely result in a psychiatric hold, which our family couldn't afford. But I also knew that his life was more important than our financial situation. Did you take him to the hospital? Yes, Your Honor. He was admitted for a 72-hour psychiatric hold. The total cost was $8,400. The hospital agreed to a payment plan that requires me to pay $350 per month for the next 2 years. Judge Caprio's mind reeled. David Thompson was now paying over $1,350 per month for his son's mental health care, more than half his total income. Mr. Thompson, with these financial obligations, how do you manage day-to-day expenses? We don't manage well, Your Honor. There are months when I have to choose between my son's therapy sessions and groceries. There are weeks when I work double shifts doing security for local events just to keep up with his medication costs. He paused, and when he spoke again, his voice carried both conviction and pain. And there are days when I wonder if he would have been better off if I had stayed with the Secret Service and earned enough money to pay for the best mental health care available, Mr. Thompson. Judge Caprio's voice was firm. Now, do you regret leaving the Secret Service? And David's answer will restore your faith in what it means to be a father. But before David could answer, Judge Caprio noticed something. Mr. Thompson, is your wife here today? David nodded toward the gallery. A woman in her late 40s stood up slowly, her eyes red from crying. Sarah Thompson had been sitting in the back row. Mrs. Thompson, Judge Caprio's voice was gentle. Would you join your husband, please? Sarah walked forward hesitantly. She was wearing scrubs. Clearly, she'd come straight from work. A hospital ID badge hung from her neck. Mrs. Thompson, you're a nurse? Yes, Your Honor. I work in the pediatric emergency department. Night shifts mostly. It's the only way our schedules work. David can be home with our son at night, and I'm home during the day. So neither of you gets much sleep. Sarah let out a sad laugh. No, Your Honor. We haven't had a full night's sleep in years. But that's what parents do, right? You sacrifice. Mrs. Thompson, can you tell me what it's been like watching your husband give up his career for your son? Sarah's voice cracked immediately. Your Honor, when David told me he was going to leave the Secret Service, I begged him not to. Not because I didn't want him home, but because I knew what he was giving up. She looked at her husband with profound love. David was somebody, Your Honor. He protected the President of the United States, and he gave all of that up to sit in hospital waiting rooms and hold our son while he cried. And how has that affected your marriage? Your Honor, David, and I haven't been on a date in 4 years. We can't afford a babysitter, and we can't leave our son alone. We communicate through text messages left on the refrigerator. She paused, tears streaming down her face now. But here's the thing, Your Honor. I love my husband more now than I did on our wedding day because I've watched him sacrifice everything for our son. How many fathers would walk away from glory to sit in the dark with a depressed teenager? Judge Caprio's voice was barely audible. Mrs. Thompson, on the day of the incident, where were you? I was at the hospital, Your Honor, working a double shift because we needed the overtime pay. David called me from the school. I'll never forget the sound of his voice. What did he say? He said, "Sarah, I got there. He's alive. Our boy is alive." And then he broke down crying in a way I'd never heard before. Sarah turned to look at the gallery. Your Honor, my husband spent 6 years making $95,000 a year protecting the most powerful person in the world. Now, he makes $28,000 protecting small businesses. And the system he served is sending him bills he can't pay for trying to keep our son alive. Judge Caprio stood up. He walked over to Sarah Thompson and did something unprecedented. He hugged her, not as a judge, as a human being, as a father who understood. But you still don't know the biggest revelation. Judge Caprio turned to his bench and picked up the police report again. Mr. Thompson, I need to ask you something about the timing of the incident. And what he's about to reveal will leave you speechless. Judge Caprio looked down at the report, his finger tracing a line of text. Mr. Thompson, according to Officer Martinez's report,
You were pulled over at 3:14 p.m., heading south on Route 95, but Jefferson Elementary School is north of your home.
you were driving in the opposite direction. The courtroom stirred. Everyone was confused now. David's face went pale. Sarah grabbed his hand. Your Honor? David's voice failed him. Mr. Thompson. Judge Caprio's tone wasn't accusatory, just deeply curious. Where were you actually going when Officer Martinez pulled you over? David looked at his wife. She nodded, giving him permission. Your Honor, after I got to the school, after I saw my son was safe, I got back in my car and I couldn't stop shaking. I started driving. I wasn't thinking clearly and I found myself heading toward the Newport Bridge. The courtroom went dead silent. I pulled into the overlook parking area and I just sat there watching the water, thinking about everything. About how I almost lost my son. About how I can't afford to keep him safe. About how maybe he'd be better off if I wasn't here to burden him with my sacrifice. Sarah was sobbing now. Mr. Thompson, Judge Caprio's voice was shaking. Are you telling me that on the day you saved your son from suicide, you were contemplating the same thing? I sat in that parking lot for 20 minutes, Your Honor, just staring at the water. And then my phone rang. It was my daughter. She's 15. She was calling about her soccer game. She wanted to know if I could come watch her play this weekend. His voice broke. And I realized that if I wasn't there, she would lose both her brother and her father. So I turned the car around, Your Honor. I started driving home. That's when Officer Martinez pulled me over. I was still doing 45 in a 25 zone because I was desperate to get home to hug my daughter, to hold my wife. Judge Caprio had tears streaming down his face. Mr. Thompson, did you tell your wife about this? Not until later that night, Your Honor. I was ashamed. Sarah spoke up, her voice fierce. Your Honor, that night, David told me everything. And I told him what I should have told him years ago. You can't pour from an empty cup. My husband has been so focused on saving our son that he forgot he was drowning too. She looked at the gallery. How many fathers out there are suffering in silence? My husband is the strongest man I know. But even the strongest men need help. Even heroes need saving. Judge Caprio stood slowly and walked directly to David Thompson. Mr. Thompson. His voice rose with moral conviction. And for decades on this bench, I have never encountered a case that so perfectly illustrates both the best of human nature and the worst of our systemic failures. He turned to address the entire courtroom. Let me tell you what I see when I look at you, Mr. Thompson. I see a man who spent 6 years ready to die for his country. I see a father who gave up financial security, professional prestige, and career advancement to be present for his mentally ill child. And I see someone who is being punished by a system that should be supporting him. Judge Caprio's voice became steel. Mr. Thompson, regarding the speeding violation that brought you to my courtroom today, all charges are dismissed. All fines are waived. All penalties are removed from your record. The courtroom erupted in applause. But I'm not doing this just because of your service to President Obama. I'm dismissing this ticket because charging you $195 for racing to save your son's life is absurd. This ticket is an insult to everything you've sacrificed. He picked up his phone. Furthermore, I'm calling Dr. Patricia Williams at Brown University. They run the Family Resilience Center. They provide free mental health services to families where caregivers are experiencing burnout. Mr. Thompson, you're not just going to get help for your son. You're going to get help for yourself. And that's not a suggestion. It's a court order. The applause was sustained. I'm also writing to Governor McKee personally. Rhode Island has programs for families of first responders who need mental health support. You protected the President of the United States. If that doesn't qualify you, I don't know what does. Judge Caprio's voice became gentle. And finally, Mr. Thompson, I want you to understand something that I don't think anyone has told you in a very long time. He looked David directly in the eyes. You are enough. Your sacrifice is enough. Your love is enough. Your son doesn't need you to be wealthy or famous or perfect. He just needs you to be there. And you are. David broke down completely. The trained Secret Service agent collapsed into his wife's arms, sobbing. Judge Caprio gave them a moment. Then he delivered his final statement. Justice isn't just about following the law, Mr. and Mrs. Thompson. It's about seeing the humanity in every person who stands before this bench. And what I see in you is the very best of what humanity can be. The video of David Thompson's case went viral within 48 hours. Over 15 million views across all platforms. Within 2 weeks, community donations exceeded $127,000 to help the Thompson family, Dr. Williams' family. Resilience Center provided free therapy for David, Sarah, and their son Jake. The governor of Rhode Island created the Thompson Family Mental Health Fund with over $2 million in initial funding to help families in similar situations. But the most important outcome happened 6 months later. David Thompson returned to Judge Caprio's courtroom, but this time, his entire family was with him, including his 16-year-old son, Jake. Jake stood before the judge and spoke with a steady, clear voice. Your Honor, for 4 years, I felt like a burden. I knew my dad gave up his dream job because of me. I wrote that suicide note because I genuinely believed everyone would be better off without me. He paused. But then I watched the video of what happened here. I heard my dad talk about sitting by the bridge. I heard my mom talk about loving my dad more because of his sacrifice. And I realized something. Jake's voice became stronger. I wasn't a burden. I was loved. There's a difference. My dad didn't sacrifice his career because he had to. He did it because he wanted to. Because that's what love looks like. He turned to his father. Dad, for 4 years I thought your sacrifice was my fault. But now I understand. It was your choice, and it was the most beautiful choice anyone has ever made for me. Judge Caprio stood and walked over to the Thompson family. Jake, how are you doing now? Your Honor, I've been in therapy twice a week. I'm on medication that's working. I'm back in school full-time. I made the honor roll last semester, and I'm playing piano again. Smiled. A real, genuine smile. Depression takes away the things you love. But I'm getting them back now, as David added. Your Honor, I've also been in therapy. Learning that I can't save everyone, that it's okay to ask for help. That taking care of myself isn't selfish, it's necessary. Judge Caprio looked at the family standing together. Mr. Thompson, do you remember what I asked you 6 months ago? Whether you regretted leaving the Secret Service, I remember, Your Honor. What's your answer now? David didn't hesitate. No regrets, Your Honor. Not a single one. Because that job gave me 6 years of purpose. But my family gives me a lifetime of meaning. Emma, the 15-year-old daughter, spoke for the first time. Your Honor, I used to be embarrassed when kids at school found out my dad wasn't in the Secret Service anymore. But now I tell everyone my dad protected President Obama and then gave it all up to protect my brother. And every single person says the same thing. Your dad is a hero. Judge Caprio's voice became solemn. Ladies and gentlemen, 6 months ago, the Thompson family stood in this courtroom, broken and desperate. Today, they stand here as a testament to what happens when a community decides to care. He looked directly at the camera. To every parent watching this who's suffering in silence, you are not alone. To every person fighting depression, you are not a burden. To every family struggling to afford mental health care, help is available. Ask for it. Demand it. Fight for it. Judge Caprio walked to the Thompson family and hugged each of them. "Thank you," he whispered to David. "Thank you for reminding me why I do this job." As they left, Jake turned back one more time. "Your Honor, I'm going to be okay. I'm going to live. I'm going to graduate. I'm going to college. And someday, when I have my own family, I'm going to tell them about the judge who saw my father, not as a defendant, but as a hero. And I'm going to teach them that love is measured not by what you have, but by what you're willing to sacrifice." Judge Frank Caprio, 78 years old, with 4 decades on the bench, stood in his courtroom after everyone had left, and he knew that this case, the Thompson family, would be the one he'd remember forever. Because it wasn't about the law, it was about love. Comment below. Have you or someone you love struggled with mental health? Share your story. Subscribe for more Judge Caprio stories that prove compassion changes lives. Share this with anyone who needs to know that asking for help is a strength, not a weakness. Remember, you are not alone. You are not a burden. You are loved.